Hi, good evening. My name is Ted Landsmark. I am a professor of practice and director of the Kitty and Michael Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy at Northeastern University. Each semester, I oversee this open classroom, which is really an open public forum for people to come together to discuss issues of pressing public policy. This semester, we're going to be talking about what we might end up doing and thinking about in a post-pandemic era, a time we hope will come soon, and a time that we know that we need to begin to plan for. This is the first time that the open classroom has been offered in this online-only format. And so I want to remind everyone that this session is being recorded. It will be archived along with all of our previous open classroom sessions. And I would ask that those of you who are watching online, please hold your questions until the end of this session. And then we will respond to those. And we'll take as many as we can. I'm deeply honored that our opening speaker tonight is Governor Michael Dukakis, the longest serving governor in the history of the Commonwealth, a presidential candidate for the Democratic Party in 1988, a highly esteemed and much loved faculty member at Northeastern for the last couple of decades, a strong transportation advocate, a former state legislator from Brookline, and my first boss in Boston when I moved here to practice law. It is a great honor for us to have Governor Dukakis with us. And let me open by just asking the governor to make a couple of opening remarks. Governor?
Ed, thank you very much. We go back a long way, and it's a great pleasure to be part of the same faculty that you've been part of. I announced my retirement officially on the 30th of June. I want to stay close to Northeastern, and I want to be as involved as I possibly can be, and to be part of this. And as you know, I've been part of these open classrooms often, and I'm a big fan of this effort to bring the public into what we do at Northeastern. Unprecedented period of time in the history of the United States. I have a slight connection to it, sad one, by the way, because in the great flu of 1918 and thereabouts, which was devastating, every one of my dad's family, including him, a young Greek immigrant who had arrived in the United States about earlier in 1912, every one of them had the flu. And two of them, my grandfather, who I obviously never knew, and my oldest uncle, both died in that epidemic. Fortunately, my dad didn't, and was this remarkable young Greek immigrant who came over here when he was 15. 12 years later, was graduating from medical school. He became a doctor on Huntington Avenue, across from the Museum of Fine Arts, and practiced medicine for 52 years. I was supposed to succeed in that capacity, but I ran into something called general physics at Swarthmore College and just couldn't get it. Got a charitable D and decided to do something else, in this case, politics and public service.
Well, I think we're all very grateful for whoever gave you that low grade, because the career you've had since has had a huge impact and has continued to be an inspiration to our students and to others who are involved in public policy, particularly those people who've had a progressive bent. But before we get into all of that detail, the moment I let it be known that you were going to be our opening guest speaker this evening, everyone asked me, how are you? And how is Kitty? How are you doing?
Well, we're really doing quite well, although really for the first time in our 57 years of married life, I had a pretty rough winter. As you know, I'd sneak out of Boston during the so-called winter quarter, get out to UCLA where I taught and taught for about 20 years. And I'd always come down with a cough for some reason. It wouldn't be disabling. I could teach and so on and so forth, but I always got a cough in Los Angeles. And my doctor out there was a wonderful guy and a graduate of Tufts Medical School, by the way, from California, Ron Sue, tell me that it had something to do with particulates in the atmosphere in Los Angeles, where the quality of the air is dramatically better than it was. I mean, I remember being at the convention in 1960 when Jack Kennedy was nominated in Los Angeles, and it was like living in a toxic stew. It was horrible. It's much, much better. But apparently there are these particulates that affect folks like me. And this year, for some reason, it not only lasted for a month, it lasted for a good deal longer than a month, and it turned into pneumonia. Before it was over, I was in the hospital twice, had surgery, and it was the first time I'd been seriously hospitalized, with one possible exception. So I'm not sure I'm going back to West again, but I do want to stay close to Northeastern. I've had a wonderful time there. These 20 years that I've spent at Northeastern University have been wonderful.
Well, we know that you're not going far. Not that many people know that you've made a habit not only of using the MBTA to go to the State House when you were governor, but you live close enough to the campus in Brookline that you regularly walk to work.
I do. I did. Yeah.
And,
a couple of miles. I mean, it's not a short walk, but good for the body and good for the soul. And so I've had the great pleasure of being able to walk to work, but to take the T off, even while I was at Northeastern. And as you know, I'm something of a fanatic when it comes to public transportation and its importance. So whatever I do as I approach my 87th birthday, which by the way will take place on Election Day, 3rd of November, I expect to be walking and taking the T often and advocating for first-rate public transportation, which is desperately needed in this country.
Well, now you have brought up the subject of Election Day. And I know that there are a lot of us who would love to hear your views on this upcoming election. And of course, you're not going to hold back on any of that, but I would like to establish a little bit of historical context first. You were the Democratic nominee for the presidency in 1988. And you managed to best a number of candidates who really constituted a very distinguished field of individuals. You beat Al Gore, and you beat a young fellow named Joe Biden. And you took on a number of leaders within the Democratic Party. You got the nomination in Atlanta. You were one of two finalists, actually, if I remember correctly. It came down to Jesse Jackson and you for the nomination. And then you went on to run a campaign where you started 17 points ahead at the outset of the campaign. But at the end of it, George H.W. Bush ended up defeating you, despite the fact that you ran better than either of your two predecessors. That is to say, better than Mondale and better than Jimmy Carter. So we're now facing an election campaign where the Democratic candidate, your colleague, has a substantial lead in the polls. What is the advice that you would give him based upon your experience in 1988?
Pay no attention to the polls and work like hell. And do everything you can, even under these very difficult circumstances, to build a grassroots organization in every single one of the 50 states. I always get nervous when people start talking about those battleground states. Every state is a battleground. It should be a battleground. And it is very important that we and anyone else who wants to be president of the United States, I didn't do this as well as I should have in 1988, build a 50-state campaign. And I can't emphasize that enough. Now, it's difficult, obviously, under these circumstances. How do you do it? I mean, you can't do a grassroots campaign as such, but it's very important, in my opinion, that the candidates, and our candidate, particularly in this case, Biden, be a very important presence all over the country. And I think you can do that. And by the way, Trump does it pretty well. With, unfortunately, maskless rallies, which, if he keeps it up, will continue to produce people with the disease. But it's just so important that in a campaign of this kind, you reach out to people all over the country and are a presence, however difficult, all over the country. And I think that's the process of happening.
In 1988, you ran very well in a number of states where Democrats had not run well before. It's been said that you laid the foundation for the election of the next Democratic president, who was actually the person who had nominated you at that 1988 convention in Atlanta, a fellow from Arkansas named Bill Clinton. You've expressed your concern about a battleground states strategy for winning the national election. Could you elaborate on that a little? How do you go about breaking down your time as among those states where you may not win at all, but where you feel a presence is essential in order to build up a national constituency?
You build an organization, and this obviously is going to be particularly difficult, and is particularly difficult under the circumstances we face here, where you put together a precinct-based organization. I didn't do this well at all, I'm sorry to say, but a precinct-based organization in which you have your folks in every single state connecting with people at the precinct level. And you can do that without a lot of money, but with lots and lots of people. And it's important that we do it. People come to me these days and say, well, you know, what do I have to do to run for fill in the blanks? And I say, and I had this conversation with a woman named Elizabeth Warren, who I'd never met. I knew about her, knew her teaching at law school and stuff, but I'd never met her. And I'll never forget her coming over and meeting with Kitty and me. And she said, what advice can you give me? And I said, go out and find yourself 2,157 precinct captains in every precinct in Massachusetts. Their job is to recruit 6 neighborhood or block captains and make personal contact on an ongoing basis with every single voting household, no exceptions. And I've given that little speech more times than I can imagine, but it works. In that particular race, with about 5 days to go, the both Boston newspapers published polls. One said that her opponent was ahead. The other said it was tied. She won by 9 percentage points. What was the difference? Precinct-based grassroots organization that won it for her.
How do you think social media affects all of that? Social media obviously helps with fundraising, but when it comes to getting out the vote, what do you think the role of social media is in mobilizing people?
I'm not the guy to ask that question. The former First Lady was wandering around in the kitchen here. I'm not the one to ask that question because I'll confess that social media is not my specialty. It adds some additional responsibilities, it adds some additional opportunities, but it does not eliminate the necessity for the kind of grassroots organization I'm talking about. Hang on just a second, a couple of hours. We've got lots of people out there who want to talk. Okay. Yes. Yes. No. You forgot it. Anyway. Yeah. Yeah. This is important. This is Northeastern. This is the open classroom. Still am a very firm believer that precinct-based organizing is absolutely critical. And if you look, for example, at the midterm elections that we just had for Congress, most of those folks, most of the Democrats who won, it was a huge turnout. Won because they were out in the street and they had organizations intensively working those precincts. And anybody who thinks that it's old-fashioned or it's all electronic or whatever, in my opinion, doesn't understand. No substitute for that worker coming up to your door, knocking on it, having a conversation, coming back, convincing, continuing that conversation, and really connecting with the electorate. And if candidates do that, they're going to be a lot more successful than otherwise. Now, one of the mistakes I made in 1988 was in spending too much time talking to people who I thought knew more than I did about how to win the primary. All of whom kind of poo-pooed the idea of precinct-based presidential campaign. Maybe, you know, for city council, but not for the presidency. A fellow named Barack Obama came along. Decided he'd run a precinct-based grassroots campaign, and it won the presidency.
Well, it's certainly one of the advantages he brought as a community organizer.
No question.
Let me take half a step back because Kitty Dukakis's very brief cameo there reminded me that even before you ran for statewide office in Massachusetts, you were practicing law. You were supervising young emerging attorneys. And one of the things you always emphasized was that you put in your billable hours, and then you go home at night for supper. And then if you're going to do your campaigning, you do your campaigning after you've done your primary work and after you've taken care of your family. So you set a tone that said that you always have to maintain a certain balance as a policymaker or as an elected official. How do you go about doing that, particularly in these very crazy times when there's so much data and input pouring in on you all the time?
It's a very good question. And you have to be selective. I mean, first you have to rely on a lot of other people. No question about it, even though you're out there working your head up. Secondly, although I used to take Friday off during campaigns, because I campaign on Sunday. as you know, when I practiced law, or when I was actively involved politically, Sunday was my day off. Sunday was my day with my family. And I really meant it. And the interesting thing about that, Ted, was that most people, I think, respected it, realized how important it was to me and to Kitty and our kids. And accepted it and applauded it to some extent. Now, I worked hard 6 days a week, but I was always home for dinner at night, unless I was in Washington someplace. And that was very important. Even if I had something to do in the evening, and needless to say, I had lots to do in the evening, I was always home for dinner with Kitty and the kids. And I think that was an important part of my routine and my approach to the job. So Sundays off, dinner at 6 o'clock at night at home were two almost unbroken rules in the Dukakis household. And not just because I wanted to be a good husband and a good father. They were important for me. Take a break, have dinner with Kitty and the kids, and be a husband and a father, and that was an important part of my life. So for prospective candidates who say, "You mean you were home for dinner at night?" I'd say, "Yeah, I was home for dinner at night at 6 o'clock. Might go out afterwards, but I wanted to be here." And it was every bit as important for me as it was for kids. And I mean that.
Serving 3 terms certainly is evidence that you are considered by the electorate to be a very effective governor. Looking back, what are the things that you are most proud of? What are the things you think you accomplished best? And what are the kinds of things that you feel as though you might not have done quite as well?
Well, the first one was losing the race for the presidency. And I just I made some mistakes that in retrospect I shouldn't have made. If the other guy's going to come at you with an attack campaign, you just can't kind of sit and say, "I'm not going to respond." And that was a big mistake. The lack of a commitment to a 50-state grassroots campaign was a mistake. I mean, I can go on. But in terms of the governorship, and remember, I lost my first race for re-election and came back to win and then returned for a 3rd term. One of the things that we faced in the mid-'70s in Massachusetts was a very, very, we were part of a Northeast that was struggling to kind of get back on its feet. The old industrial states of Massachusetts at the time, interestingly enough, was one of them, were not doing well. And the question was, how do you turn that around? And so the heart of what we tried to do was to revive dozens of really depressed older industrial communities. Wasn't easy. And even though it looked as if we were doing a great job, the public didn't share that feeling. The numbers look good, but one of the things you got to remember is that when you go through what we went through in the mid-'70s, and had been going through this kind of long, depressed period, it takes a while for people to believe that, in fact, it is changing. So I was defeated the first time around, came back, and as you know, won, and then won for a 3rd time. But one of the things that I think we were able to do, and it wasn't just me, I mean, it was a lot of things, was to give people a sense of hope, a sense that we really had a better future ahead of us, that we had to work at it, but that we could help to revive a lot of these older industrial communities, which were hurting and hurting very badly. And we started with Lowell, Massachusetts. Why Lowell? Well, that's where my dad's family arrived when they got off the boat. An industrial city, one that was in terrible, terrible shape. And had a congressman subject in the United States Senate named Paul Tsongas, also Greek American, who was very committed to the same kind of thing that I was. And part of this was trying to surround myself with really good people. I mean, I can't emphasize this enough. You don't do this by yourself. It is so important that you try to attract good people who can go to work with commitment and idealism and integrity, and begin to work at this revitalization of an older and pretty depressed.
So there are,
and that was so important, actually.
Yeah, there are a number of people who would say that we're in a very similar time now because of the economic implosion that has resulted because of COVID. What were the kinds of investments that you made at that time in order to revive key parts of the economy?
Well, part of it was being a cheerleader, to tell you the truth. Is that an investment? I don't know. But I mean, you had to convey the sense that we really could make a difference. Actually, it was in lousy shape. And we got a fair amount of help from Washington and from our congressional delegation in working at that. Some of it was just convincing people that we could make a difference. And attracting folks, most of whom, by the way, were from Massachusetts. I didn't do a lot of national searches. Nothing against national searchers, but I wanted people who had a real commitment to the state, had been here, in many cases had been born and brought up here, and were going to stick around after they left public service. And fortunately, this is a state with very talented people, some of whom were born and grow up here, some of whom, like you, came here, made a commitment to the state, and in that sense, you're really quite fortunate if you're governor, because you really have a very deep talent pool. Now you've got to attract them, you've got to bring them in, you've got to convince them that this is something that they should want to do. But I can't emphasize enough the importance of that kind of talent available to you. And people, by the way, Ted, who believe in public service, who want to do public service, think it's important. And if they think you think it's important and you're serious, they'll work their heads off for you. And that was a very essential ingredient in the state's revival.
So you wanted to make sure you recruited individuals who would be accountable for the consequences of their decisions and
Right.
still around after they had left public service.
Exactly, yes.
When you're talking to students now at Northeastern or on the West Coast, what is it that you say to them to inspire them to sustain that kind of commitment to serving the public?
I tell them that the most satisfying and rewarding thing you can do in public life is make a difference in the lives of your fellow citizens. And that's what politics makes it possible for you to do. It's not the only thing that will make it possible for you to do that, but very, very important. And that's a phrase and an appeal that I use all the time. Nothing is more personally fulfilling and satisfying than being in a position where you can make a difference in the lives of your fellow citizens. And I really believe that. And I've been able to live that kind of life. I try very hard to convince my students, young people generally, that they can do the same. I think it's one of the reasons why this state in particular has lots and lots and lots of idealistic young people. You teach them, I teach them. We've worked with them. That really do make a difference. That really do make a difference.
You know, there's been a lot of discussion, often wrenching discussion about diversity and inclusion and disparities and the like. In your cabinet and in your senior administrators, you appointed a significant number of women and people of color to very high-ranking positions with a great deal of authority. Two questions. Why did you do that at that point in time? And how did you find those individuals? Because the story always goes out that you can't find highly qualified people to run agencies and the like. So how did you find people?
Well, first you have to have a commitment. I mean, I wanted an administration that looked like the state. I wanted an administration that was diverse, that had a broad range of highly talented people that came from a variety of backgrounds. I think some of that has to do with my own background as an immigrant's kid, and the sense that I wanted to be part of something that really reflected that. Then you have to go out and look for folks. And I love telling this one story. I could tell you a million stories about recruiting and finding people, women, people of color, minorities, and so forth, that became extremely important members of my administration and great public servants. But one of the folks that I was able to attract into the administration was a fellow named Paul Parks, who was an engineer. And I wanted him to become my Secretary of Education because he had been deeply and actively involved in educational policy. Who was Parks? He was a young black kid from Indiana who had served in a segregated military unit during World War II. In fact, he was one of the American soldiers who liberated people in concentration camps. And he was 18 when he went in. Came out of the service and went to Purdue in Indiana, because that's where his home was. And he was admitted to Purdue. But Ted, he couldn't live in a dormitory because he was black. At a state school or a state-connected school. That was the US of A. And in point of fact, I grew up, as you know, in a suburb immediately west of Boston. I mean, it's practically, you wouldn't know if you didn't know that Brookline is a separate community. People of color could not live in this town when I was a kid, with 3 exceptions. 2 janitors and their families, whose kids, by the way, eventually worked for me in professional positions in state government, and a world-renowned tenor who somehow found somebody on Pill Hill in Brookline to sell him a house. That was it. That was it. It wasn't until the late 60s that we put together a fair housing committee and we started agitating and going to work and trying to open up this town, now considered a very liberal community. So people of color could live here. And in point of fact, not only couldn't they live outside of Brookline, with some exceptions in historically black communities in a variety of communities, cities and towns around the state. But they had to live, they couldn't live on this side of the railroad tracks. They could work over here, but they had to go back on the other side of the railroad tracks to find a place to live. That was the US of A, and that was, quote, liberal Boston. when I was a kid. And don't ask me why, but there was something about that that just bothered the hell out of me. I mean, I was 9 or 10 when I first started feeling strongly about this kind of enforced segregation. Oh yeah, the laws, at least in Massachusetts, were, quote, liberal, but not the reality. And I can't tell you why I had that feeling, but I felt very strongly about it. And obviously had an opportunity in public service to do something about it.
We don't see that many elected officials now who have picked up that banner and moved it forward. Indeed, in many places, we've seen a stepping back from that kind of commitment to racial and social equity. At this moment, that is a major national issue, and it's an issue that's being contested all across the United States, even in communities where one wouldn't necessarily have expected to see that. How do you think that that's going to affect the upcoming election? And also, how do you think that that has impacted on recent elections throughout New England over the past few years?
It remains a factor, no question about it. Are we getting somewhat better, notwithstanding what we've been seeing in this particular case, a president of the United States who's using, in my judgment, using the racial issue to stoke the fires of bias and prejudice, what I think is a disgraceful way. But I'm cautiously optimistic election will reflect the fact that those kinds of appeals to racial antagonism, bias, prejudice are becoming less of a political factor as time goes on. This will be a test, no question about it, because there isn't much doubt that he used race as an issue in this campaign. But it really will be a test. And if, in point of fact, Biden wins it, will tell us something. Still too slow, still taking too long to get there. And, but it will tell us something about changing attitudes among young people. I'll be very much surprised if we don't see major increases in turnout among young people, as we did in the midterms 2 years ago. And these kids, for the most part, believe very strongly in a world and a country that is open and accepting and welcoming all kinds of folks. Now, where did all of this come from in a personal sense? Well, I think, as I said earlier, some of this had to do with my background and my parents coming over here as immigrant kids. And some of it, came out of this experience of seeing a society in which people of color, immigrant groups and so forth were just subjected to out and out discrimination, racial, ethnic, and otherwise.
Joe Biden's first personnel decision was to select an African-American woman to be his vice presidential selection. When you were running, there was a lot of talk about trying to balance tickets, and you selected as your running mate a senator from Texas. And many people thought that that was to provide both geographic and some policy balance. You were viewed as very progressive coming out of the Massachusetts Miracle. How do you think that kind of balance affects people's votes now? And what do you see in your students, both on the East Coast and West Coast, in terms of what they expect to see in candidates?
Let me take the second question first. These days, especially among young people, I expect to see young people who are looking for diversity, openness, kinds of things that this country ought to stand for. And it's interesting that you're absolutely right. Back in 1988, the question of who my running mate would be from an ethnic or racial standpoint really wasn't a particularly big issue at the time. It is now, it should be. For one thing, this is a more diverse country. Certainly it's browner and blacker, and that will continue. And not surprisingly, people are going to expect much, much more diversity. And thirdly, and I think it's important to make this point, I found as governor that a diverse administration was a better administration. Why? Because we had a broad cross-section of folks, brown, black, white, who gave us and the state the benefit of their experience, their commitment, and their background. And I think my administrations were better and more effective because, in fact, they had that kind of diversity. And these days, I don't think there's any question that, of course, we have a much larger pool of talented young people who come out of all kinds of backgrounds.
So we don't see that kind of diversity in the executive ranks in Washington at this point. What's your sense of what the current administration may be doing, may be right or wrong for the country at this moment?
Well, when it comes to diversity, doesn't understand it. And he really is a racist. Yeah, there's a question about it. Look at his comments just, what was it, the other day about Nelson Mandela, one of the great, great historic figures in our lifetimes. He just doesn't get it, doesn't understand it, doesn't see the importance of it. And in point of fact, now, quite obviously, is now playing to racial prejudice. I mean, this appeal to suburbanites that somehow if Biden gets elected, there will be a flood of minorities invading their neighborhood. The whole thing is just disgusting, in my opinion. And wrong, because to repeat, diversity for me was a strength. I don't mean just politically, it was a strength in terms of giving me administrations that, yes, were diverse, but also extremely talented. You know, you asked how you go about doing that, by sitting down with folks in the community and in these communities and saying, who are the people that you think are extremely talented in your particular ethnic or racial group? And I never had any difficulty getting people to respond to that. And to come to me with extremely talented folks who gave us much stronger administrations because of our diversity. I think these days we understand that a lot better than we did then. But.
Well, in that regard then, what accounts for the president's support, which continues to run 35%, 40%, whatever? What accounts for the president's support in the face of all of that overt bigotry?
Is it bigotry? Is it ignorance? What is it? We still have too many people who I think view themselves as being good people who just don't understand how important it is that our politics be diverse, that we reach out to previously disenfranchised groups and we bring them into the process. We'll have to wait until the 3rd of November and my 87th birthday to see if I'm right, but I think we are beginning to move in that direction. And if, in fact, Joe Biden wins this election, particularly given the kind of racism of the Trump administration and his current campaign, I think it'll tell you a good deal about what's happening in the United States.
There's been a fair amount of research recently, not only about disparities, but about the embedded caste system and class system that exists within a capitalist structure that, to a large extent, seems to require a hierarchy that's based on race or gender in order to succeed economically. When you were governor, you seemed unfazed by that. And in fact, you made a number of economic investments in communities across Massachusetts that were in fact diverse and were in fact, like Lowell and Lawrence, cities that clearly were well populated with immigrants and people of color. So the question remains, why does bigotry, from your perspective, continue to exist despite all of the protests and despite all of the discussion that's gone on around the need to open the society?
In a word, it beats the hell out of me. I don't understand it. I just don't understand it. My experience was, as I've stated it, that if you reached out and brought people into your administration, brought them into the process, you'd govern better, you'd lead better, you understood much more effectively what it was that was behind the concerns of these disenfranchised groups, if you will. And I think my life, as well as my leadership, at least I hope so, was infinitely better because that was my approach to what was going on. But a lot of this is ignorance. A lot of this is not knowing other kinds of folks, not having that kind of contact with diverse groups of people. Again, I think it's important to recognize that we're doing a lot better than we were back in those days, but we just have to keep working at it and working hard at it. And let's hope, at least in this case, that the national election reflects that, because if it does, there'll be a really significant change.
And if it doesn't?
Keep fighting. But it will be disappointing, because so many of us have worked so hard to try to create that kind of country, that kind of society, and at the same time help this country to become an international leader in that sense. And we've gone backwards badly under Trump. I mean, these comments about, just one, these comments about African countries. I mean, the comment about Nelson Mandela, was there a more saintly man than Nelson Mandela? And gutsy. Not only saintly, but he was so strong. What is Trump thinking about? What is he doing? Where does he get these ideas? I don't know. I just don't know. But we'll see what happens on the 3rd of November.
Well, hopefully people will turn out to vote as
very important. Very important. Turnout is going to be extremely important.
This year, for the first time in many years, as far as I've heard, Northeastern will turn over our primary athletic facility, Matthews Arena, to be a polling place. And there are already efforts on campus to mobilize and attract students to be poll workers. Some are already beginning to go through their training. And there's a major get out the vote effort and voter registration effort as among our students and staff and faculty. So I think everyone is working hard to bring about the right result. Assuming that a good result, in fact, is achieved, and based upon your experience with Massachusetts Economic Miracle, what are the kinds of things that you would suggest be invested in early on in order to promote some sort of economic recovery across the country? In Massachusetts and nationally, we've looked at major retailers failing. 40% of our restaurants may well be closed by the end of this year. People's shopping patterns have changed. There's infrastructure to be rebuilt. What would you see as key areas for investment that might jumpstart a recovery?
Well, for one thing, I'm much more optimistic than some of the pessimists that are out there. I think we'll turn around pretty quickly. But we need a vaccine that works and not one that's, you know, shoved out there the day before the election in just a incredible political playing with this whole thing. I mean, we're talking about a vaccine here. And this is no time for politics and no time for this game playing. But I think you'll see the country respond again, depending on who is elected, strongly, positively. I think people will respond to that kind of appeal strongly and positively. And I don't think there's any secret about what we have to invest in. Our infrastructure desperately needs work. Training for good jobs, helping people to get the kind of training they need to be productive people. We're doing some of that, but nowhere near what we should. The fact that we're going to have labor shortages because the workforce is not growing, which done right will produce a demand for well-trained employees of all colors and all backgrounds. And nothing could be better for the country than that. It began before the pandemic. It will grow in importance and the challenge for us. So we've prepared to take advantage of that. It could be a hugely important plus for us if we do it right. So I think both when it comes to the training of excellent people and investing in the right things, we should be able to do well. I will say this to you, I think spending $900 billion a year on the military and talking about war in space, particularly coming from a draft dodger who didn't have the guts to serve his country back during the Vietnam era, is a little tough to take, to tell you the truth. And it's not that those of us who serve in the military deserve any credit. Most of us went in because we were drafted. But nothing bothers me more than to listen to Trump praise the military when in point of fact, we now know that he was dissing them and insulting them and, you know, for reasons I don't understand. And has been quoted as saying that anybody who let himself be drafted in the Vietnam War was a fool, you know. That He'd never let that happen. I mean, he didn't, with this phony claim of bum heel and this kind of stuff, which is just nonsense. But I'm quite optimistic, and I think we know what we have to do.
You brought up job training, workforce training.
Yeah.
Half of the New England states have lost population over the last decade. And the population is being sustained across New England largely through the arrival of new immigrants.
That's right.
Individuals with very diverse language skills and diverse global backgrounds. What do you see as the key elements of bringing that new population into the workforce in a way where they not only contribute to stabilizing their own families and their own lives, but they also bring a level of economic stability to New England's communities?
And not just economic stability, Ted. They're extremely talented people. I don't know whether you've been struck by this as much as I have. I suspect you have. But these days, when I watch television news, especially about the pandemic, the diversity in the people who are stars of these panel shows, who are the scientists or the doctors, so forth. The diversity of that group is incredible. And these are Americans. They're from Massachusetts. And we are so lucky to have them. One of the things that concerns me about this latest stuff with China, you know, another Cold War. I mean, we haven't had enough Cold War, we're gonna have another Cold War. Is the number of, there are 200, there were, I don't know what's happened these days, but prior to the pandemic, there were 250,000 Chinese students in American colleges and universities. Many of those students will stay here. They'll do their graduate work here. They'll decide they want to be part of who we are because of who we are and what we are. And to lose that resource because of this essentially racist stuff about, you know, the China flu, as our president now likes to call it. It's so stupid. I don't know how many times I've been on campuses where panels of experts, doctors, scientists, and so forth, have always included immigrants who stay with us and make the United States, and in this particular case, Massachusetts, home. I hope we understand just how important that is and how valuable it is, and how important it is for us to be welcoming these folks and not turning them down. Now that, you know, I'm not defending Chinese, the policy of the Chinese Communist Party. I think what's happened in Hong Kong has been very, very unfortunate. Look, I'm a Democrat with a small d. I mean, I want people to enjoy the democratic society. But deliberately going after the Chinese as largely for political reasons, the China virus, you know, I mean, what is that? Is the wrong way to go. We should not be spending $900 billion on the military. A significant portion of that ought to be going into our infrastructure and the training we talked about, and all of these important things. And I hope under a new administration we will.
So speaking about a new administration, it's been suggested that one way or another we're going to have a new administration in January. If the incumbent is reelected, he will feel as though he has a mandate to complete work that he started and to solidify his legacy. Not having to run again will free him to accomplish things that he may have held back on. And conversely, if Joe Biden were to win, a whole new group of people would come into office with a different set of perspectives. What are the policy recommendations that you would make for whatever the new administration is? And also, since we haven't spoken about it yet, during your term as governor, you made significant investments in the kind of infrastructure that was about alleviating environmental issues and environmental degradation and supporting sustainability and resilience. So could you talk about the kinds of policy recommendations you would have for an administration as it comes into place in January, and also about your views of the environment, resilience, and sustainability?
Well, I'd put our environmental issues at the top of the list, because climate change isn't a joke. I mean, the West is burning down even as we speak. And we do not have a lot of time to deal with that. We'd better get cracking on it right now. Now, Trump simply doesn't understand this, unless it's Florida, in which case, of course, you got to protect the coast, because politically it will kill him not to do that. But this is an existential issue. The future of the planet and its people, and our kids and grandkids and great-grandkids, is at stake here. That means that this so important issue has got to be dealt with, and dealt with quickly. And we can do so. It's not that difficult. In point of fact, as you know as well as anybody, investing in non-polluting renewable energy is now cleaner than the old forms of producing energy. That's remarkable, isn't it? And by the way, driven to a very great extent by the private sector, which to its credit has gotten into this. Let's encourage them. Let's support them. Let's make this a pollution-free energy economy. That's something we can do. And without a great deal of sacrifice. I mean, we're not talking about, this is just, it not only makes sense from an environmental standpoint, it makes sense from an economic standpoint.
Green jobs, among other things.
Green jobs. I mean, as we just heard from a candidate for the United States Senate. Transportation. Okay, so I'm a little obsessive when it comes to the importance of investing in non-polluting transportation. That's what rail does for you as compared with the automobile. We should be deeply involved in that, deeply involved. And we'd better do so, and in a hurry. But none of this requires enormous sacrifice. That's the interesting thing about it. For the most part, what we're talking about, needed investments that not only make sense, but economically will help us to create jobs and green jobs and a healthier environment. And we'd better get cracking on this fast.
So it sounds as though you've stated what you would consider to be the top three policy areas that Democrats should focus on: the environment, infrastructure, employment and training programs, race. Is there anything else that you would see as a priority issue for a new administration in Washington in January?
Well, there are all kinds of things that we ought to be interested in investing in. You're familiar with what we did out in Western Massachusetts with something called Mass MoCA. Now, what was that? A severely depressed northwest corner of Massachusetts, severely depressed, has been revived dramatically by investments in the arts of all things. Who would have thought that that was possible? But people with a lot more brains than I have who came to me and came to us and said, look, there's an opportunity to do this. We want you to push it. And I said, I agree with you, let's go at it. Has transformed that corner of Massachusetts by investing in the arts and improving the quality of life of there are so many opportunities here to do good, do well, and make life better for people. And we're not getting much of them right now, but a new administration could be enormously effective in doing this.
What is it that Biden and Harris supporters can say to Trump supporters, many of whom feel as though their concerns have been ignored by previous administrations, including Democratic administrations, right, that might be able to sway a number of people to vote for the Democratic ticket this year? Well, that's a question that came in.
It wasn't that as successful as I hoped it would be, but I think one of the things that I was able to appeal to people about was the fact that, at least in Massachusetts, it was a significant economic turnaround because we began investing in older industrial communities, to be sure, but with new technology, new approaches, new training, all this kind of stuff. And if we have a Democratic administration beginning in January, it is very important that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris go into those communities and help them to invest, as we did, in different economies, but job-creating economies, economies that would improve the quality of their lives, their communities, and so forth. And it took a while, but over time, I think we did that quite successfully. That's what we've got to do nationally. A new administration has got to be in Ohio, in West Virginia. I carried West Virginia by 12 percentage points. Today, it's a red state. Why is that? And there are some hopeful signs out there. There are members of Congress from West Virginia and California collaborating on training programs for kids in West Virginia to develop the skills they need to work remotely with Silicon Valley companies. What? Absolutely. And doesn't that make sense? You have programmers in West Virginia making $70,000 a year, a king's ransom when it comes to the wages that are being paid down there, working with Silicon Valley companies. And interestingly enough, this was all developed by a Democratic congressman from California and a Republican congressman from West Virginia. There are a lot of partnerships like that are possible.
So certainly one of the infrastructure investments that you could see would be in digital infrastructure and improving access to the internet. We may well have learned something from this pandemic because of the way everyone is now learning and studying.
No question about it. No question about it. And by the way, with labor shortages in some of those so-called high-tech that can provide jobs for people in places like West Virginia. because of this new technology. And doesn't that make sense? We got to be publicizing these kinds of things. We got to be telling people about this kind of collaboration. It makes all kinds of sense. And I hope we will.
What would you advise the president to do to address the issues of violence that have arisen very dramatically, particularly over the course of the last 6, 8, 10 months?
Can I be a little parochial about this?
Sure.
I think it's fair to say that as I was growing up, Boston had a fairly typical police force. And then something began to happen. Younger police officers, many of them sons, and to some extent, time went on, daughters, of existing police officers, began to go to Northeastern University and major in criminal justice, or Boston State as it was called at the time. Bill Bratton was one of them. There were others who had a different approach to policing. They called it community policing, which was what? Basically connecting with the communities that they were policing. There's a reason why Boston is not one of the communities that's been having its problems these days. It's not because we don't have issues, to be sure, recently. But the fact that this new approach to policing, and it's real, in which police officers need to work closely with communities, not as antagonists, but as collaborators, really has made a difference. I mean, you've lived in the city long enough to witness this. Not that everything's wonderful, but it's a lot better than it used to be. And this whole new generation of younger police officers, and Bratton happened to be one of them, but there were many others, made a huge difference, I think, in police community relations. And not just here, because Bratton, as you know, went to New York, cut the homicide rate in half under Giuliani, and then Giuliani fired him. And then he ended up in Los Angeles and was there for 7.5 years. And I had an opportunity to see him in action during the winters that I spent at UCLA. Police community relations in Los Angeles are so different from what they were when Bratton first went out there. There's no comparison. It's not perfect, but one thing, the police force itself looks a lot more like the population than it did. The collaboration is close and real. Policing is not easy. I mean, you're dealing with some very difficult human problems. But I would say to folks, come to Boston and take a look at what's happened here.
Now, speaking of policing and community policing and criminal justice, one of our graduate students asks how, apart from simply listening to communities, how can you get people in communities to make a commitment to institutions that have hurt them? How do you rebuild trust? How do you get people who are lifelong learners to rethink the way they may make commitments to the institutions that have done harm to them?
You bring people together. You bring people together. I call them working groups. I mean, you can call them anything you want. But for example, in Boston, and I'm not close to it as I used to be, virtually every police district has a community council of sorts that meets on a regular basis with local police forces. That never happened back when I was a kid, ever. Nobody ever talked about it. These days, it's routine police work. It's what police officers are expected to do in their communities. That makes a huge difference. A huge difference. People are meeting together, working together, reasoning together. They'll come together in many, many ways. And doesn't mean that we still aren't going to have some serious issues, but the difference between police community relations in Boston back when I was growing up and today is like night and day. I hope it'll continue, but it's bringing people together, sitting down, reasoning together, listening together, solving problems together.
We will have the head of our criminal justice programs as a speaker later this semester, and I expect that she will also address some of these questions. But another question, related question that has come up is whether you have any concern that there's going to be violence after the election in November, just because of how divided the country has become, not only around issues of race, but also around issues of access and economics.
Remember I mentioned working groups? I'm a believer in bringing people together, having people sit down together. It took me a while, it took me about 20 years to figure it out. But what I discovered over an extended period of time was that if you reached out to folks, whether they were with you politically or not, and said, look, I need some help in dealing with this problem. Would you be part of a group that sits down together and sees if we and tries to figure out if we can work this thing out together? I never remember anybody saying, sorry, Governor, I'm not interested. People want to be part of this. They want to be helpful. They want to be constructively involved. And these working groups worked. So when you say to me, how do you go about dealing with this? Create working groups, bring people together. And it's amazing what happens when they discover each other, come together. It turns out that with very few exceptions, they want the same thing, a decent, safe, happy, constructive community.
So we're almost at the end of our questions, and this is quite a bit of wisdom that you've been able to pass on. Is there any one thing that you would want to say to the students who are online, the faculty, the staff, some of the administrators, and to the general public who have been watching and who have respected and revered your public service over the years? Something that passes on the kinds of values that you brought to public service in the decades that you've been engaged in Massachusetts and nationally?
Well, let me say two things. First, to especially young prospective public servants, nothing is more important than your integrity. And it's not difficult to be active, constructive public servant. Be honest. It's just, I never found having a problem. Now, as I say to my students, plan to live moderately. If you want to make a lot of money, don't go into public service. But to repeat what I said at the beginning, nothing more personally fulfilling or satisfying than being in a position where you can make a difference in the lives of your fellow citizens. And that's what public service is all about. So that's number one. And secondly, reach out to people. And here I'm repeating myself again. Bring them into the process. As I said a few minutes ago, that I don't remember anybody who I asked to participate in one of these working groups to say to me, sorry, Governor, I'm not interested. Americans want to be involved constructively. And if somebody, whether it's the mayor, the governor, the president, or whatever, says, I need you, will you be part of this effort? Never remember anybody saying, I'm not interested. Even when they were not political supporters. If it was the governor, it was the mayor, it was whatever, they wanted to be a part of the solution. And they were.
Yeah, there's a big difference between complaining about what we see that's not right and actively engaging in those kinds of activities that can make things right. And particularly now, as we are only 2 months from the election, anyone who might have been holding back or saying, well, I'll wait until everything is closer, now has the opportunity to jump in and to be a participant in something that really does make a difference. Many of the elections, not only nationally, but locally, are decided by very, very thin margins.
That's right.
You know, we look at the Trump victory in 16, and it was less than 100,000 votes nationally that ultimately decided the election in those battleground states, even as Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. So if there was ever a moment for folks to jump in and to engage in public service, whether it's voting or bringing out the vote or actually becoming a policymaker as we work to educate the next generations of policymakers in this part of the world and around the world, this is a moment to engage.
No question about it.
This course is a part of it. It's less a course than a forum, really, to bring people together where folks can discuss openly a number of challenging questions. One of the last questions that came in was around how we can change the makeup of the Senate. And that's going to be something that we're going to be dealing with over the course of the semester, along with issues of job training, economics, higher education, elementary education, culture and art, and the way they play into factors, health, criminal justice, design and planning. Over the course of this semester, we'll be covering all of those issues, and I encourage folks to take a look at the list of speakers as they are posted. Again, all of these sessions are archived and are available to folks even if they are not available to join us in this 6 to 8 on Wednesday evening time slot. And I cannot thank Governor Dukakis enough for a conversation that has been enlightening and prescient in its views of what could happen, and mostly hopeful and optimistic about what we can do in the role of public policy in terms of shaping futures that are not generic. They impact on every one of us. And my last word of thanks is that we're grateful that you are in Brookline, that you're well settled, that you will continue to be available to us for all kinds of advice and consultation. So as much as I thank you for the work you've already done, I am going to give you a preliminary thanks for all of the work that we expect that you're going to be available to continue to do on behalf of shaping public policy in this country. So thank you very much for this time. And thank you for being who you are.
Thanks so much, Ted. I'm looking
Thanks,
forward to
Mike.
myself. Okay.
We'll see everyone next week. Take care.